Professor Mariana. This is very informal. Just
That's what I'm looking for.
among friends, and these are our colleagues from on the KL City Hall, right? So let me begin with some quick salutations. Dato' Banda, Dato' Sri, Town Planner Dr. Maimuna for Sharif. I always call her ED, but now I call her
FED.
FED.
Former ED.
Our Executive Director Tuan Ismaji Sakarin, our Executive Director Tuan Haji Muhammad, Executive Director Puan Asdina, who has very kindly agreed to do a little introduction for you about what Dbkl does. Our directors and heads of department, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and salam Madadi Malaysia. So I had the pleasure of introducing Professor Mariana Mozzicato, and today we really are very honored to have you as our special guest. Professor Mariana is Professor of Innovation and Public Value at the University College London's Bartlett School. She's also the founding director of the UCL Institute of Innovation and Public Purpose. Her works and publications have contributed greatly to the role of the public sector as a driver of innovation in our era of dynamic technological change. And she's also redefining the concept of value economics. Mariana, as I told you yesterday, we are really grateful to you. And I remember your inspiring lecture at the 10th session of the World Urban Forum in Abu Dhabi in 2020, or the eve of the COVID global pandemic. At that time, of course, you were a guest of our Dato' Sri Maimuna in her capacity as Under Secretary General and Executive Director of UNITED. So I'm not sure you remember what you had spoken about, but I think you might be surprised. And at that time, you spoke on shaping equitable urban futures, and where you put to us the key question: how narratives and practices around governance, planning, and urban economies need to shift to enable fundamental transformations to a more equitable future. And 2 weeks later, we had the pandemic and the global close down, right? And I really feel that it was a very prescient lecture, very far-sighted, as the coming 12 months after Wolf 10 and COVID-19 and lockdown economies laid bare the inequalities and the systematic weakening of public institutions, especially at the local level. And this resulted in a terrible loss of lives all over the world. At that time, when the Dato' Sri Maimuna, as the head of Bandaraya, was also heading a network of 1,600 cities. We were working from Wuhan to Rome to Bogota as the pandemic rolled throughout the world. And then we could see how if you disinvest or not invest in local government, you have a major problem in delivering services at critical moments, at critical junctures. So I'm very happy that you're here and you had a chance to speak to our Prime Minister. Hopefully you told you to do the right thing.
And the conference is smart.
Very good, yes.
So busy.
Yeah. So basically, we are very fortunate indeed to have you here. And on behalf of Mayor Maimuna, now colleagues, a very warm welcome to Kuala City Hall. Dato' Panda, Executive Directors, without further ado, please let me introduce Puan Aslina, who is our Executive Director for Management, and she's leading the governance reform here at Dbkl. And under her astute leadership, Dbkl is becoming more resilient in terms of revenue collection, talent management, and improved efficiency. So this is the run of show. Puan Aslina will give us a short brief about Kuala Lumpur City Hall, our role as city managers, and the challenges that we face as a public institution. After which, we welcome a reaction from you, Professor Mariana, and we have a brief friendly Q&A with our colleagues here. And then we will invite Dato' Panda to share her observations and conclude the session. So, without further ado, Puan Aslina, you have the stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Neil. Our Mr. MC and Mr. Moderator for today. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Salam Malaysia Madani and a very good afternoon to all. Mainnya Dato' Sri Mayunan, our distinguished guest, Professor Mariana. Can I call you Cor?
Of course. Mariana. Maria.
And our executive directors and head of departments. It is truly an honor to have this opportunity to engage with you, Mariana, today. Your work, particularly in reimagining the role of the public sector as a dynamic value creator, has provided fresh energy and new perspective to public institutions around the world. So allow me to begin with providing a brief background on Kuala Lumpur City Hall before I proceed to outline the key challenges we are currently facing. You can have a look at your right side. Okay. So basically, City Hall or Dbkl is a local authority entrusted with managing and developing Malaysia's capital city. So established in April 1961, Dbkl has grown in parallel with the city's rapid development. So when Kuala Lumpur was officially declared as a city on the 1st February 1972, which every year we will celebrate this 1st February. So Dbkl became its governing body, led by the Mayor of Kuala Lumpur, who is appointed by the federal government. So our vision is to become a prosperous city for all by 2030. So one that is livable, resilient, competitive and inclusive. So our mission is to lead and deliver quality urban services, sustainable development and good governance that enhance the well-being of Kuala Lumpur residents. So we are also guided by a set of shared values captured in the acronym Dbkl, which stands for D for dynamic, B actually bijak in Malay, so we call it as it's actually in English wisdom, creative and sustainable. So when you can have a look at our current organizational chart, which is by way of Kuala Lumpur, we have 24 departments. Sorry for that. So we have 4 executive directors. So each responsible of a key portfolio like planning, project management, the socio-economic development and management, which I currently lead, covering finance, human capital, procurement, ICT. So each of the executive directors provide multiple departments, and these departments are led by the senior directors and deputy directors, which is in front of us today, to manage the day-to-day operations and across services delivered across the city. So besides that, to ensure on the responsiveness to local needs, Dbkl also maintain 11 branch offices across the city. So, and at the same time, we also have the advisory board to advise, to give and provide strategic advice to the Bay. And in summary, we actually have a few functions that currently become our main responsibility, include like urban planning, infrastructure development, environmental management, housing, licensing, public health and traffic control. So which is about, in population of Kuala Lumpur is about 2 million residents. And the size area of Kuala Lumpur is about 243 kilometers. So as urban challenges evolve, collaboration is no longer obstacle. So what Mayor always said that it is essential for Kuala Lumpur embrace the 4P principle like public, private, people and partnership. So to deliver meaningful urban transformation, we actually actively engage with a wide network of stakeholders across multiple sectors. So as what the screen in front of you now, this basically categories of our stakeholders and clients. And Kuala Lumpur City Hall, has introduced 50 programs for 24-26 a strategic framework based on 5 main priorities, which is plan-led development, inclusive community, green and sustainable city, effective communication, and good governance. So together with these 5 main priorities, there are 15 flagship programs which is aimed to transform Kuala Lumpur into more progressive, inclusive, green, communicative, and well-governed city. So in addition to our local responsibilities, Kuala Lumpur also firmly committed to building and maintaining strong international ties with other cities in the world. Now, I would like to briefly outline some of the key issues and challenges currently faced by Kuala Lumpur City Hall in fulfilling our responsibility as a local authority. So these challenges reflect the complexity of governing a rapidly evolving global city, and we believe your insight, Mariana, especially those drawn from your research on mission-driven innovation and public value, could offer valuable guidance as we navigate these realities. So the first one, I would like to touch on the balancing growth and equity. So while Kuala Lumpur is an economic powerhouse, inequality persists. So many low-income communities still struggle to access affordable housing, digital infrastructure, and quality green spaces. So we are committed to more inclusive development, but translating the economic progress into equitable urban outcomes is a complex task. And to talk about the fiscal pressures, so Kuala Lumpur or Dbkl's revenue structure is largely dependent on traditional sources such as property assessment taxes, licenses, fines and compounds, and development charges. At the same time, the cost of maintaining infrastructure, responding to the climate risk, and upgrading digital services continues to grow. So this fiscal pressure often limits our ability to invest in long-term transformative initiative. And when we talk about institutional and digital transformation, we are actually on the track of digital transformation journey. However, the legacy system, siloed organizational structures, and limited in-house digital talent are barriers to full realizations. So we seek to become more agile, data-informed, citizen-focused organization, but we know that transformation requires internal capability, not just new tools. So besides that, the dependence on the consultants and vendors. So Professor, one of the more critical challenges we would like your insight on is our growing dependence on consultants and external vendors, especially in high-impact areas such as strategic planning and policy development, digitalization and ICT infrastructure, on the projects, feasibility studies and business models. So while these actors often provide needed technical expertise, we are increasingly concerned that this dependence may be eroding Dbkl's own strategic capabilities and institutional confidence. So it also creates a culture of risk aversion where public officers like us feel they must outsource key thinking and innovation. So allow me, Prof, to get today actually I bring your book to get your autograph. So let me reflect on your work actually on the Bitcoin, because I think the 4 major issues of the dependence on consultants and vendors, we would like to have your insight on this. Because in your book, the Bitcoin, you have powerfully argued that outsourcing thinking leads to a hollowing out of the public sector's capacity, where governments lost the ability to ask bold questions, experiment, and own their visions. So that message resonates strongly with our situations. So we are eager to hear your views, Marina, on how can Dbkl rebuild its internal expertise, particularly in areas like urban innovation, data governance, and public value design. So secondly, what strategic steps can help shift us from a passive commissioning of external expertise to active leadership of complex urban missions? And thirdly, how can we foster a public service culture that sees uncertainty as a space for innovation, not just something to be managed by consultants. We don't want to be vendor driven anymore. So I think with that I end my on the challenges that we face currently, and actually Dbkl is committed to be a smart, inclusive and sustainable city that reflects the value of Malaysia Madani, embrace the innovation and leave no one behind. So through strong governance and bold innovations, we actually aim to deliver the vision of the next city for all. So I think with that, I conclude my remarks and would like to invite Dr. Neil to lead us into the next session. Of course, the presentation from you, Mariana, whom we are truly honored to have with us today. Thank you. Terima kasih.
In a very casual conversation, feel free to share your thoughts and ideas. I think Astina has laid out very clearly some of the key challenges that all public servants are facing all around the world, I think, and particularly here in Asia, which is practically urban distinct, and of course in KL, which is the capital city. Over to you.
Okay. Is it possible to put up the 4 challenges again? So we have them in front of us. So first, I should say that Neil, besides thanking you so much for being an amazing host, including last night, I thought you were going to say something different when you said you remembered what I said in Abu Dhabi. Because what I remember from Abu Dhabi was, first of all, we had the president of Afghanistan.
Correct.
Right? Just before, imagine that, the disaster of how the U.S. pulled out. And as great as it was that he was there, he said something I really disagreed with. So I should be careful, because of course we should, respect his figure, but he said something that to me represents the false dichotomy that we are here really to discuss today. He said, in a complex world, we no longer need planning, we need design thinking. What? What does that even mean? We need to plan in new ways. We need to bring complexity and design thinking to the way we plan. But this idea that there's the old style bureaucrat who plans, and that the modern world, which is full of uncertainties and the polycrisis, as we would call it today, needs to just have kind of complex modeling, welcome uncertainty, and use design thinking, to me was part of the problem, right? What we need is to plan better than ever, and to especially allow ourselves within the civil service to, first of all, recognize the civil service as collectively creating value, not just redistributing, not just facilitating, not just enabling. But to do that, it requires skills, particular skills, what we call in my institute, the dynamic, not static, the dynamic capabilities within our public institutions that are precisely those that I think have intentionally, not by coincidence, intentionally been decimated over the years. And this consultification that you brought up, the 4th challenge, is only the symptom. It's not the cause. The symptom, if you think about it, the cause, is that if we are so risk averse, if we're so worried to make mistakes inside the civil service, because as soon as one makes a mistake, you're on the front page of the newspaper, as opposed to the venture capitalists who brag about their mistakes, because it's true, for every successful investment, you have to accept 6 or 7 or 8 failures. And the entrepreneurs brag about that. All the failures, the trial and error and error and error, the learning by doing that's required to succeed. We don't have that mindset within, often the civil service, also because of the blame. As soon as a mistake is done, again, front page of the newspaper. So that risk averseness, even when the capability exists within the civil service, let alone when we have decimated it, even when it exists, it's amazing how there's this, willingness simply to rubber stamp when, a consultant, either Deloitte, PwC, KPMG, BCG, because of the moving risk away, which is ironic, of course, because when these consultants make mistakes, they actually don't take the blame, but that's a different story. But let me just maybe take it in order of these 4 challenges. The first one is so important, but it's related to the second one. Actually, they're all related to each other. The reason why I talk about missions and a mission-oriented approach is that if we actually are interested in exactly the areas that you talked about, well-being for all, yeah, goals, health for all during COVID, reducing the digital divide, having a net zero city, what we worked on, Mayor, what we were in the Council of Urban Initiatives, where we said, what is a healthy city? Health for all. What is a green city? Sustainability for all. What is a just city? So it was healthy, green, and just. And we asked in the council that you chaired and that we ran with the LSE cities and my institute, what does it mean for the design, not only of the city, but the very important word you mentioned, public-private partnerships. If we get that right, if we, for example, go after different types of sustainable objectives by transforming how we do transport, how we do food, how we do, again, not just transport, but sustainable mobility. That requires innovation, investment, human capital formation. What is growth? Growth is an outcome of investment, innovation, human capital formation. So the problem is how to actually set goals, what I call missions, that by design require that investment in the public and private sector, in the private sector across many different industries, right? Climate change is not just about security, it's about all sorts of different areas, how we build, the type of cement, the type of steel, how we move, how we eat. That can then cause growth, but it's directed growth. What doesn't cause growth is just blah, blah, blah. Talking about net zero and then not forming the policies that actually catalyze investment in the business sector. So if we have a mission-oriented approach focused on problems, we're then a local leader or a national leader. I see the problems very similar at the national and the local level. We just have more experimentation at the local level. If we can make sure that businesses across sectors, food, energy, transport, materials, digital services, are working with government to invest and to innovate around the challenges, then we can definitely bring growth and equity and problem solving together. If instead the government is just handing out subsidies, guarantees, loans, tax incentives, without the confidence and the boldness of what the problem is, then that won't cause growth. That simply gives out money. Again, tax incentives, which might, for example, increase profits, but it doesn't increase investment. And don't forget, investment is the key driver of growth. So even in the UK, we have high profits but low investment. We are 28 in the OECD for business investment. Very extractive economy. Most of the money goes back to the financial sector. It doesn't really go to the real economy. So the first issue is how do we balance, I would say, growth and problem solving, and how do we then make sure that the rewards and the returns that come about are socialized so it's also equitable growth, right? Let me just give you an example so that it's more specific. Even the famous moon landing, which I wrote about in Mission Economy, the idea was that there was a challenge. Sorry. Oh, now it works. There was a challenge, which was the space race. They turned it into a mission to the moon and back in a short amount of time. But to do that, NASA realized they had to change how they did procurement, the purchasing. They had to change it from cost plus towards challenge-oriented procurement to do what? To solve all the different problems the astronauts had. How would they go to the bathroom, literally, in the lunar module? How would they eat? What would they wear, their clothes? So by using a tool that all governments have, which is government purchasing, procurement, often 30% of a government budget, to solve the different problems, they ended up fostering lots of innovation. Baby diapers, home insulation, baby formula, right? Because of the dried food that the astronauts would eat. Software. These were solutions to problems that the government very clearly led in terms of the directionality, but they worked with the private sector to solve it and fostered bottom-up innovation, right? So it was clearly government-led from above, but open on the how. They left open the how. They didn't micromanage business. because that would hurt innovation. So it's bottom-up innovation across many sectors, software, electronics, materials, aerospace, to solve very concrete problems that the astronauts had. So the growth that came about was not because the government said, we want growth, the space age, like today, quantum computing, artificial intelligence. No. They said, we have problems to solve. Help us solve them. The solutions to those problems produce these different innovations, which ultimately cause growth. So growth is an outcome. Growth is not the goal. Growth is the outcome if we can foster public and private sector investment. Also, because NASA was confident of its role, it made sure the contracts were equitable. They said no excess profits, not no profits, because you don't get to the moon with charity. I think we over-rely today on philanthropy and charity because government and business don't do their jobs properly. They said we need good government, good business working together, but the contracts must be fair. So no excess profits, no rents. Park, Slip, and Nikado would call these rents, extractive contracts. And again, it was so interesting that they said that. In other words, they wanted to make sure they worked together, but not abusing each other's power, what I would call a symbiotic, mutualistic contract. I used to say reciprocity until Trump took the word with reciprocal tariffs. Yeah. So public-private partnership can be a bad partnership, or it can be a good partnership. I don't know if anyone knows biology, but you might remember with ecosystems, biologists are always careful. Is it a parasitic ecosystem or is it a symbiotic, mutualistic ecosystem? So in order to solve the problems that the astronauts had, NASA had the confidence to say, and let's make sure it's a good ecosystem, a good partnership. So everything I just said, I don't think we do. We don't have clear missions. We often just blah, 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 climate change, well-being, but we don't transform these into clarity where we can actually say yes or no, did we achieve it? To the moon and back in a short amount of time, did they achieve it? What is the equivalent with climate, with well-being, with the digital divide? You don't need someone to come in from outside to tell you what the missions are. This needs to be negotiated with citizens, with government, to set these missions in a clear, directed way. We often do not have that. Second, we just end up having sectoral strategies. We might say, oh, for a country or for a city, it's important to be, competitive in digital or a particular sector, as opposed to say we have problems where all our different sectors need to invest and help us innovate towards. And third, we often don't have the confidence. If you look at specific companies, sometimes it's, I don't want to say blackmailing, but it's, oh, unless you give us this tax incentive, we're leaving. Yeah? Or unless you give us this favor, we're leaving. And the government says, oh, okay, fine, we'll give you the favor. Yeah? So really think through, what does a city want to be known for? How do we make sure that it's not through the usual race to the bottom to attract capital, which ends up not producing equitable growth or sustainable growth? That is very important. But unless there is a clear mission, there's no reason to actually foster cross-sectoral innovation. There's no reason also to make sure the contracts are fair. So I really always start with that. What are the problems that we're trying to solve, and then work backwards and design that economic system to deliver it. I don't think this works very well. Should I not use it? Or okay. So the fiscal pressures is related to that, because
It's okay, we can name it. That's all right, we can tell you.
unless we understand how financing works, we end up talking about financial gaps. Yeah, that works better. Thank you. Thank you. Oh. Sorry, I think this works. Yeah, this works. So the fiscal pressures, some are artificial and some are real. For example, cities are organized in different ways, and in sub-cities there's very little money that even comes from the federal, from the national, to the city themselves. But also when the city doesn't have that catalytic effect of the business sector, you also don't have what Keynes called the multiplier. For every dollar of public money, how much can we capitalize in the economy, which then grows the economy? And if we have the wrong fiscal rules, you're experiencing that today in England, where there's very tight fiscal rule. where the government is not allowed to spend more than it taxes, then it means we're not looking at the economy in a dynamic way. We don't value the public investment. We have a short-run mindset, and we say we need to raise the tax before the government can spend, which we know we do not do with war, right? No one ever said we're not going to go fight the war because there's no tax revenue. For war, money is always created. It's only for climate, for health, for education that we say there's no money. And so when there is a mission, coming back to the first point, then what does it mean to actually also create the finances, which ultimately means stimulate the economy, so the denominator of debt to GDP, if you want, which then actually reduces the ratio, right? If we're just creating debt and putting out bonds or any sort of government funds without stimulating the economy, then you have the numerator of debt to GDP that rises and the denominator stays static. In Europe, we had this when the pressure on the member states like Italy, Greece, and Spain after the financial crisis was to lower their debt, lower the deficit in order to receive the financing from the European Commission and the Troika, the IMF, the World Bank, and the European Commission. And what happened was, like Spain and Italy and Greece, they cut the deficit in order to receive the funds, but the debt to GDP ratio rose. So deficits fell, but the ratio rose because they were cutting, there was austerity, they were cutting all these different areas, which ultimately are the key drivers of growth, the denominator. So if we invest in healthy citizens, if we invest in education, if we invest in research and development, if we invest in good science industry linkages, if we invest in all the different areas that are social infrastructure and physical infrastructure, it will, in the short term, increase the government spending and the short-run deficit, but in the long term, it increases growth, which is, again, the denominator. In this basic math, which is that x, any number, over 0 is infinity. Yeah, remember? Basic math? Any number, x, y, b, over 0 is infinity. It means let's not be stupid with our finances to just focus on the numerator, on the debt and the deficit. Think about what we know are the key drivers of growth. My first point was directed growth. It's not growth for growth's sake. It's growth derived from problem solving. But we need to resist this idea that this can happen without serious public investment. But if the public investment is done well, which catalyzes business investment, again, what Keynes talked about is the multiplier, then ultimately that denominator rises and we keep the debt to GDP ratio in check. And this is really important also as conversations between a mayor and the national government, the prime minister, but also with the funding agencies, whether it's the National Development Bank, a multilateral development bank, a sovereign wealth fund, having this confident conversation that the investments that are required in the city are central not only for the people and their well-being, but also to drive that long-term growth is really key. And if we don't get that, we end up just always talking about the fiscal pressures or financial gaps. And even when the finance arrives, it's often the wrong finance, right? So, talking about well-being for all at Kuala Lumpur, we should then ask ourselves, what does it mean for the structure of finance, for the structure of public-private partnerships, for the structure of even thinking of budgeting to deliver on what the goal is? And the institutional and digital transformation, as well as the last point on dependence on consultants and vendors, both of them ultimately have to do with the dynamic capabilities which governments need. You mentioned COVID. COVID, we've realized how badly prepared we were, right? We couldn't even deliver PPE, personal protection equipment, to the frontline workers many of whom died. In London, we clapped them very condescendingly. Said, "Oh, thank you," on Thursdays. We would go out with their pens. Did you do that here? And then COVID stops. We stopped investing in them. We called them essential workers for a short amount of time, but we didn't actually value the social infrastructure in which they worked. Them also as people who had to be trained In fact, today we have in the UK strikes of the junior doctors and many people who work in the healthcare system, even after the COVID years where we realized how important a strong, capable healthcare system is. Why? Because the cost of inaction is greater than the cost of action. That comes back to the fiscal pressure. If we don't make these investments, it will cost us more later. Forget for a minute that we even care about people. Forget our hearts, just the brain, just the economic brain. It will cost us more. It will cost us more later not to make these investments today, right? So we are creating fiscal pressure by being stupid about the finances. But in order to actually develop these capabilities, to even define what does it mean to be prepared for the next pandemic? What does it mean to be prepared for the climate tragedies where we have droughts and floods and so on? That requires investment, again, within the brain of the civil service. And it was interesting that during COVID, like during war, we woke up just for a minute. We said, oh yeah, of course, we need to do outcomes-oriented procurement, like they did to get to the moon, right? Advanced purchasing, scale economies in order to get both the vaccine and the PPEs. And we stopped after COVID. Again, we went back to the old way to do procurement, not advanced purchasing, not outcomes-oriented procurement. In Italy, for example, where I'm from, we were 100% reliant on Chinese personal protection equipment when COVID began. You remember COVID hit Italy, was one of the countries that was hit strongest in northern Italy. Within 3 months, we were 100% independent of personal protection equipment, with 137 small and medium Italian companies producing all of Italy's PPE. Why? Because they use outcomes-oriented procurement to deliver what the country needed, and they use the industrial strategy, kind of tools to make that happen. Then COVID stops. We go back to the old industrial strategy. We go back to cost plus, price-focused procurement, and no longer think in that outcomes-oriented way. So ultimately, it's only when we care about a problem, when we treat it as urgent, instead of saying 2030 or 2050, far away in the distant past. No one said that during COVID. They wanted the solutions now, but they needed to work with others. That's why they used outcomes-oriented procurement. We only seem to know how to do urgency in war. Again, no one said, we'll win the war in 30 years. People want to win the war now. That's why the military is smart in how it uses procurement. In COVID, we wanted to solve the problem right away. In COVID, you remember they used the word war room. We had the Ministry of Education, the Ministry of Health, the Ministry of Finance, the military, working together to solve the problems. In my own city in London, we had the homeless people were taken off the street, put into hotels. All the different services that usually they have such a hard time to access were done in one place. Mental health, food, job, shelter, all in one place. So it was an easy welfare state to access. Only during COVID. COVID stops, no more. Homeless still in the street and having to fill out many forms. And there's films by Kat Loach that shows people committed suicide in normal Panza because it's so degrading, so condescending, the access to these welfare systems that are not people-centric. So I just think all these things are related. They're not four different challenges. This is about how do we have a people-centered economy that focuses on the problems that people have and structuring the economic system to deliver the solutions, as opposed to say, oh, let's invest in health and it's also good for the economy. No, if health for all is the goal, what does it mean for how we value, for how we innovate, for how we finance? What is the public sector capacity that we need? Remember the infodemic, yeah? During COVID, there was the test and trace requirement. So few countries had that ability. In the UK, we paid Deloitte 1.5 million a day to deliver test and trace, and they failed because it's not their expertise, right? And it was amazing, even when the capacity exists, why is it that governments do not use it? And when you use it, learning by doing, you can also prove it. So the need to also, as I started off, admitting it might be hard. It's not about facilitating, right? This word that, I don't know if you use the word facilitation or de-risk, if not. You need to welcome the uncertainty, experiment, trial and error. And that's why some countries like Chile have something called El Laboratorio de Gobierno, the GovLab, a laboratory across government, yeah, again, that the different ministries work on together to experiment with new tools like outcomes-oriented procurements. And coming back to the first point, equity, the issue of partnership and symbiotic ecosystem, what does it mean to experiment with new contracts? So in Germany, for example, the only reason there's green steel in the steel sector is because the public bank, called the KfW, put as a condition that the loan provided to the steel sector was conditional that the sector lower the material content of production. So if the sector said, no, we're not interested, the government can say, go to the end of the queue, baby, come back when you change your mind. So how they did it was up to them. Clear direction by government, lower the material content of production, so you have sustainable materials. But how you do it is up to you, and we will help you do it by giving you a loan, but we are helping you so that you are part of the solution and not part of the problem. During COVID, again, in the UK, they just gave money to companies because they were having troubles. We gave 600 million to EasyJet, an airline, just because it was not flying. It was a loan, no conditions attached. In France, they gave money to Renault and Air France, conditional that these companies lower their carbon emissions. So again, experimenting with new contracts that are goal-oriented, so the way that we actually think of the public-private partnership is mission-oriented and not just money, no? We just ran a water commission with the president of Singapore, myself, and the head of the WTO. We were the commissioners. 80% of industrial wastewater is not recycled. That's crazy, given that the water right is given from the government to the private sector, put in the contract, in the water contract. And so using all the different contracts, the procurement contract, the water contracts, the property rights, the loans, the subsidies, the guarantees, not just as money shifting around, but as opportunities for changing that social contract, the collective intelligence, the collaboration between public, private, but also third sector institutions to move towards goals. First of all, it's needed, but also it might require some experimentation. So it always goes back to, are we willing to admit that what we're trying to do is to have directed growth around solving problems which require changes in the current status quo of how government institutions interact with other actors. And I'll just stop there, because unless we have the mission, there's no reason to actually create the capabilities. Unless there's no mission, there's no reason to create smart financing. We can just go back to fixed market failure. Unless we have a mission, there's no reason to have digital transformation. Digital is not a sector, it's a general purpose capability that's required for everything. For sustainability, of course, for the digital divide, for strong health systems. So always starting with what the goals are and working backwards to define these dynamic capabilities is what's required. But I think we have problems on all four fronts. And just lastly, we are currently, and this is an invitation for a next meeting, we are currently working with Bloomberg Philanthropies on developing a public sector capability index, working with cities in particular. I think it's just as important, equally important at the national level, but we're working with cities because city mayors have a much closer relationship with all the different stakeholders than at the national level, where there's more blah, blah, blah. And we're working currently with 60 cities. And I would love it if Kuala Lumpur joined. Sorry?
You should include Kuala.
Absolutely. And so we work with the city teams to better understand your own experience of what these capabilities are, but also how they develop. And these capabilities include the ability to be flexible, to be agile, but also to listen to citizens, the capability of empathy, listening, not just sympathy. And so, yes, I'm very curious if we can speak also over dinner of what that would look like to collaborate. Good day.
Thank you. Perhaps our mayor or if sort of view about this should got a vision clearly put there. Because I think you're very right now. We need to be very clear about our vision before we can start and looking at all the other issues. But if you allow just about 10 or 15 minutes, perhaps open to the floor, questions. So if you could raise your hand and then we'll get the mic to you.
So, my question is, how has digitalization changed innovation behavior nowadays? Is there any relationship?
How it has changed the way that your own government at the city level approaches the problems. But the issue, I think, is that what do we even mean by digitalization? Are we talking about, more data? And so the ability of governments to process and to actually make sure that the data itself is not having also too much, in terms of the consultants, intermediation, not necessarily with consultants, but at the company level. So for example, let me see an example. Ada who was the mayor of Barcelona, she said, citizens are creating the data actually. Data doesn't fall from the sky. Every time we access Grab, your app here, instead of Uber, City Mapper, anytime we access Google, we are creating data. And she brought in to the city, she hired hackers, computer hackers, software hackers, into the city because she said we should be recognizing, first of all, that the data is created by the citizens, but also making sure that the government, the city government, has the ability to process that data and to use it to improve the way that the city makes decisions, on housing and on transport. And so a much more unintermediated, not through the big tech companies that end up owning the data, but she called it a sort of a city-level data commons with expertise from, the startup community, including actually also the venture capital community, who ultimately found it an honor to work for the city. And that, I think, was very important because that's about human capital. We also had the same thing in London where GDS, Government Digital Services, it was created by a group within the BBC. When the national government said, we want to have our own platform, why should you go to Google to download a white paper? And they wanted to produce what ultimately became gov.uk. They gave the contract to a private sector company called Serco, which globally gets a lot of these contracts. And they produced a terrible website for the government. The BBC guys inside the BBC said, this is ridiculous, we can do this better. And they had developed within this public institution, very famous, the BBC, the digital capacity. They ended up moving over to the Cabinet Office, setting up Government Digital Services. It ended up winning a global design award. You can look up the history of GDS. But the most interesting thing is these people who went from the BBC to the Cabinet Office to set up Government Digital Services, one of the first things they did was to say, let's stop talking about citizens as clients or customers. Talk about them as users with human rights. So how will people, through the digital platforms, access their human rights to have an easy relationship with government, to access their passports, their driver's license, their voting registration? And they had an arrow pointing outside. That this is someone called Mike Bracken, who I later also hired in the Institute to do teaching. He said the first thing we needed to do was to change the relationship between the government and citizens in terms of how we even thought of that relationship in terms of data and digital platforms. And I just think it's an interesting lesson because it's a microcosm of where all the problems are. We outsource the data and the digital, you have a lot of intermediation, and we end up seeing citizens as just clients or customers of that process versus as users of human rights. And so once we think in that way, then what do we mean by innovation? It becomes also not just innovation in terms of technological innovation, but as much as organizational innovation, social innovation, and how people experience ultimately what are their human rights, human right to shelter, human right to good transport, human right to accessing these different well-being and welfare tools should be done, with a different relationship, even on how we understand how data is structured and where it comes from.
I'm the head of music unit in Kuala.
Music.
Yeah, music. So under myself, we have an orchestra full time. not full size, but 60 piece. So the question I have is, for some people who do not enjoy concerts, who do not enjoy dance, no theater, no sports, how do we convince them to say that it is valuable and worthwhile to invest in these services in the city?
When I define missions, I often say, it has to be bold and inspirational. And the way that we should inspire is also having a national conversation about what kind of society do we even want. And if we go back to our own development as a human being, it was often through music, through poetry, through literature that we learn how to dream. Yeah? What does it mean to be human? Antoine Saint-Exupéry, a famous writer who wrote The Little Prince, he said, you don't build ships by giving people some wood and say, go build a ship. You make them dream the deep blue sea. And then they're going to need the ship to go, to explore the deep blue sea. So music, again, the arts, as ways to enable our heart and mind to connect and to allow us as a society to dream about the big blue sea, which then helps to define those missions that I talked about in a non-technocratic way, but in a way that really inspires our soul and also, as you say, fosters more empathy, more solidarity between us, is critical. And that's why I also worry when we think of innovation, coming also to the innovation question, as purely kind of technological and about data, as opposed to the kinds of also social innovations that we require and the kind of skills we need in people's critical thinking, no? That we end up having an education system which overly emphasizes the STEM subjects, the hard sciences, and not enough music, philosophy, debate, even being able to argue well and to have a critical mind instead of just following orders, the yes man, the yes woman. That is critical for a healthy society. And so you pose the question, and I'm sure you have a better answer, but I would argue it's impossible to talk about emissions unless they're co-created with people. And it's impossible for people to be part of that co-creation process if their brains have been dumbed down and they don't even know how to dream together, how to negotiate together, how to argue together in a civilized way. And the arts have always been fundamental to that human ability to do that. And by the way, Franklin D. Roosevelt, during the Great Depression, when you organized the recovery, coming back to the fiscal pressures, there was a depression. They needed to stimulate the economy. He brought in artists, designers, architects, musicians as part of the economic recovery process. No one does that anymore. Again, it becomes very technocratic, and we talk about data, and we'll talk about sciences and artificial intelligence and so on. By the way, we don't invest enough even in those things. But it's a very important, but you should be congratulated that you have a head of music in the city and an orchestra. But in the same way that we don't value the health workers, we definitely don't value, I'm sure, the music and the arts enough. So you should spread the news that you have this in the city, because it's quite extraordinary.
Yeah.
I don't know, it's very common in cities.
The local cities have the orchestra, yeah. But we just had the Kuala Lumpur, the orchestra festival recently, yeah. Kuala Lumpur Orchestra Festival. And I'm also putting a lot of emphasis on the music, the culture, and heritage,
Sports.
arts and sports. Yeah, I think that's very, very important, because when you go to music, is kind of like you see that you can music also can unify it all. This is very important for the city, but not many cities in Malaysia they have what we have in Kuala Lumpur. I always mention to my colleagues, I've been mayor of Penang I've been there for 39 years, and I was also the head at one time, the president of the Malaysian Association of Local Authorities in Malaysia. I told my colleague, you are very blessed. You have everything the other mayors, your colleagues outside, they dream of. We just name it, Kuala Lumpur have it. Yes, but how can we utilize it
for us and also for the people. That's why I keep on telling them, we have everything.
Amazing.
Yes, we have everything, but now we only need to move forward and then utilize the facilities that we have. Yes. Okay. Any more?
Just that maybe my question is a bit bold or maybe a bit general to us. It's just that can we act on the climate to how we will be act to it and how how will we know it's working on the climate? So because I'm a landscape, so the question is related to my profession as well. Thank you.
It's a great question. And there's such a link between how we organize the landscape and also then, for example, the water problem. In this Global Commission on the Economics of Water, we looked at green water, not just blue water. Blue water is the water in the rivers and the seas and the lakes. The green water is the water that transpires from the ground, from the soil, into the air, and ultimately later becomes rain. And when we deforest, when we don't have biodiversity on the ground, then we prevent that green water from forming. And that creates a huge hydrological crisis, which we currently have globally. And first of all, it should also remind us it's a global problem. When deforestation of the Amazon or here, it's been shown to cause floods and droughts in another part of the world. So there's a strong link between climate, biodiversity, and the land and water issue. And so the landscapers working with those who are knowledgeable about the science of biodiversity is critical for keeping this environment in check. But maybe I relate it also back to the data. In Copenhagen, they set themselves at the city level to be the greenest city in the world. And what was so interesting was that then they needed to solve lots of different problems to be greener. And ultimately, it helped the local startups to scale up because the government at the city level was very clear that it wanted to be the greenest city in the world. And then they asked what it meant for lots of different problems they had around sustainable mobility, but also food systems in the city, even the food in the schools to be more healthy and sustainable. It then required them to work with the startups in a new way. And they ended up scaling to the point that today, Denmark as a country, and it's tiny Denmark, so it's very small, is the #1 provider to China of high-tech green digital services. And that competency, that innovation hub, if you want, came from the city level, wanting to, again, perform in a much better way across all the different climate-related dimensions the city had. So I just bring that up because that first point, balancing growth and sustainability and equity, it doesn't happen by talking about it. It happens, again, as I mentioned, by solving problems. And so one way you know when it's not happening is if you don't actually see solutions on the ground to any of the problems that the city has. But also if on the second point, the fiscal pressures, if the way the city is thinking about climate action more as a cost and not as an investment, so even in how it budgets for those investments is done in the incorrect way because it doesn't model the long run benefits to the city of paying now for what will later become more expensive if it has to pick up the mess later. All these things are very important, and how, coming back to the consultants too, the dynamic capabilities of how we do outcomes-oriented budgeting, how we value this role of public investment. And Nick Stern's report on climate change was all about the cost of inaction is greater than the cost of action. So, seeing these, again, like with COVID, the cost of having strong health systems today is much lower than waiting for the next pandemic, being in lockdown again, which stops economic activity. So I think more important than just saying, how do we know if we're doing it right? It's how do we know if the way that we're even thinking about the economy, and I speak as an economist, and doing the modeling is part of the problem. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy because we don't understand how the economy works and differentiating the short run from the long run, the costs versus the investment, the current spending versus a long-term investment. We will by design fail when we try to have our climate action. But I don't know, I'm sure you have more important lessons at the city level on what it means to do these things seriously. But ultimately, unless we treat it as an urgent problem, as a cross-sectoral problem in the business sector, as a cross-ministerial problem at the government level, climate is not just for the Ministry of the Environment. In Brazil, by the way, a country that's very interesting, they put the ecological transition in the finance ministry. That already helps us solve a big part of the problem. Because usually what happens is finance is here, the economy is here, they think they're the smart ones, and far away from the center, you have the Minister of Health or the Minister of the Environment saying, wait, we have some problems to solve. If you put those problems that need solving in the finance ministry, then the way they do the budgeting, the way they structure the finance, needs to be corresponding to what the problems are on the ground. And it's interesting, coming back to the example I gave in Germany, where the public bank, which gave the money to the steel sector conditional that it become greener, it only happens if that bank, which is responsible to the finance minister, has to perform around the social objectives. Otherwise, it's just money given around to sectors that are begging for money.
My background is finance, and I did a finance department before this, actually, before the management. So actually, it's very interesting when we talk about the finance role in terms of looking at the problem, what happened to other. For example, we have from the landscaping aspect, from the health aspect, but how can us Dbkl better align its planning and budgeting processes with long-term public value? We are actually talking about long-term public value or investment now. So, but beyond the short-term project cycles and KPIs. So how are we going to align this planning and the budgeting? Because our planning and budgeting now, we only actually for the government, the local government like Dbkl, we actually focusing on the current year for a year. And how, with your advice for us to actually to creation of the public values for the long term, how we actually align this planning and budgeting?
It's a problem that all governments have, even at the national level. And we just informed in the UK, the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, the idea that the problem was these false fiscal constraints, so that the fiscal rule had to change in order to enable these long-term public investments. And the problem in the UK, which is very common, is that one, they self-impose the harm, self-harm. They said that for every year you need to raise the tax revenue that corresponds to the public investment, which again, doesn't make any sense because you can actually, by simulating growth, even though the current public investment is higher than the tax revenue, you ultimately, if done right, as I mentioned, you can see that the economy which that creates a higher budget, right? You're stimulating economic growth, unlike a household, right? Governments and households are not the same thing. But also they had a rule that the rate of return, if you want, of the public investment had to be shown within 3 years, when actually it often takes maybe 5 or 10 years for that public investment to show that public value and the public return. So to extend the time from 3 years to 5 years to 7 years. So there's those two different issues, which is not to self-impose that the tax revenue and the public investment have to be the same year by year, but also that the return doesn't have to be, that you need to give yourself time to actually show the return. But also, I always say there would never have been a moon landing had they done a cost-benefit analysis, right? Because that kind of, ability to dream of what the real problems are in society, you need to not have static metrics like net present value and cost-benefit analysis, which sometimes makes sense. But for these big ambitions, like those of a city, you need to also have much more dynamic metrics. Had they blown up just before getting to the moon, would that have still been a failed experiment? Along the way, all the problems that they solved, that I mentioned, across many different sectors, the baby formula, the software industry, all the digital innovations that happen, the new materials, the new food, the new insulation, that happened anyway, even if they had blown up just before getting to the moon. So how we define success also needs to change. Of course, we want mission accomplished, but we also need to look at the dynamic spillovers along the way that government should be trying to foster precisely by trying to catalyze the investment across many different sectors. If you can achieve that, that is part of your success. So that means you need metrics within the Treasury, within the Economics Ministry, that are capturing these economy-wide dynamic spillovers that happen along the way towards mission accomplished. But currently, I don't know what you call it in the UK, we call it the Green Book, which is how we evaluate the public investment. It's very, very static. So we've been working with the government to think about these metrics that capture the dynamic spillovers. Because as Keynes said, he said the point of government is not to make things a little bit better or a little bit worse. It's to really do what's not being done at all. And that vision and mission of what's not being done at all and the economy-wide transformation that's required, we need metrics, literally in our books of how we do the books, the bookkeeping, that capture if we're succeeding, coming back to your question about are we succeeding or not, to stimulate that economy-wide investment, which ultimately creates jobs, creates training, productivity.
I'm from Planning Department. My question is, as public officials responsible for a long-term urban planning, we often face the challenge of balancing short-term political pressure with the need for sustainable and strategic development goals. What innovative government approaches would you recommend to ensure continuity for long-term public mission and values, even in the face of political or administrative changes?
It's a great question, and I began to think about missions, not in terms of policy, but organizational missions. And it's interesting how, for example, when I wrote The Entrepreneurial State back in 2013, I said, why is it only that it's the military organizations that have long-termism? Yeah? And it's because a society values winning the war that we have actually set up, in some countries, innovation agencies in the military that are independent from the political process because they know they need that long-termism. So again, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. When we don't value the societal goals like equity, well-being, and climate, and so on, we then end up forming organizations that are short-termist and that are subject to the electoral cycle too. And so it's interesting that DARPA, which is the Defense Department's innovation agency in the US government, which basically came up with the internet, but many of the technologies in our smartphones were publicly funded through the military-industrial complex. The underlying organizations were not subject to the short-term political cycle. And they explicitly brought in people, experts, into these agencies and told them, take risks, don't worry about, just immediately succeeding. And they were brought in, I don't know if you have the concept here of secondment, seconded from, say, the university, but they became civil servants. And again, we don't have the equivalent of that in health and energy because we haven't valued it. So even in Italy, our biggest state-owned enterprise, IRI, it was called l'Istituzione della Ricostruzione Italiana. It had 3 phases. It was public, but not politicized. It was public and super politicized, and then it was privatized. And the second and third phase were equally disastrous. The first phase, public, but not politicized, with the political party and the electoral cycle and the short-termism, was its most successful phase. They even built the Autostrada del Sole, the motorway, from northern Italy to the end of the boot within just 4 years. Later, when they privatized, it took them 30 years just to do Milano-Torino, which is like distance. And they were able to attract the top people. It was an honor for the best managers in the country. They wanted to work in IRI when it was public and not politicized. So it's also about skills and human capital. How do we make it the sexiest thing, to work in government, where the youth that come out of, high schools or university think it's great and exciting to work inside government. But that requires a mind shift. It means instead of thinking of the public sector as de-risking the private sector, the narrative and it's not just narrative, it's about the culture, the job descriptions, the human resourcing, the remit of an organization, and the unpoliticalization of it. How do we make it the best place to work? In terms of feeling valued, feeling that you have, that is about creativity, the music point, right? Music and creativity, they go hand in hand. Do we have creative thinking and culture within government? No, in most. No, we don't have flexible, agile, thinking out of the box bureaucracies. So these issues of what have we learned when problems were urgent in terms of the skills that were required in interministerial coordination, but also the longevity or question of the organization to not allow it to become politicized. So even if there's a new government, the people working in that organization can continue to, develop the skills and the learning by doing. If you're constantly changing what you're doing, because there's a new ministry, a new government, a new boss, then you don't have learning by doing. You almost become autistic, constantly changing. Yeah? And so it's a very important question because it comes back to what do we know about how people learn? Yeah, literally, human beings, how do they learn? How do children learn? How do we learn how to ride a bicycle? By falling off and getting up again. If we change the model of the bicycle every time we fall off, you'll never learn how to ride the bike. So as the new minister, the new president, the new prime minister is constantly changing, and the people working in the organization are not allowed that continuity to learn in order to adapt and be flexible, we will end up with down government. And then we need the consultants. We're even dumber, but they come in pretending they're smart.
On that note,
Do the PowerPoint.
yes. Yeah, PowerPoint. On that note, I would like to thank you so much, Mariana. And before we conclude, I have the pleasure to invite Dato' Banda, Dato' Sri Maivuna Mochari to give us the benefit of our observations and to officially close this afternoon's discussion with Professor Mariana Uzakato. Over to you, Dato' Sri.
Thank you so much, Dr. Neil and Marina. Thank you so much for having nearly 2 hours with us. When I received the invitation from Saindami to speak at the biodiversity this afternoon, I saw your name there, and I quickly WhatsApp you. And I said, well, are you coming to Kuala Lumpur? I said, yes. Can you please share maybe 1 hour with us, with my colleagues at the head departments level? Then you said that, no problem, sister, not 1 hour, 2 hours is okay. I know that your time here is very, very precious, and I know Mariana, since I was in the UN, and I was the chair of the Urban Initiative Council, together with Richard Sennett, and Mariana is the member of that council, and we work very, very close, and of course, the council is in London, but we used to meet, and then on organizations and all that, and then also Mariana has been is one of our at the executive board meeting of Secretary General always invited Mariana, especially when we talk about the strategic oversights and all that, and you give all your knowledge and then share the knowledge with us. So I really appreciate that you are here. And then just by WhatsApp, not even an official email. Thank you so much for your kindness. And then I am very happy that you share your wisdom, your experience with my senior officer here, because sometimes I treat them like my kids, I'm the mother. Sometimes the kids, they will listen to other people than their own mother. Even though the message is the same. Don't play with fire. For example, I said to my daughter, that's why. But if another person, don't play with fire, okay, I will listen. So I think that is need a third person to deliver the message that which I think many of the areas, as I already mentioned to them, thank you so much. And I think that we are on the same wavelength. For example, like I remember during the World Open Forum, and with that message on the design, and we must have a plan-led development. That's what when I joined you and joined Dbkl, first thing that we came out with this flagship program, you can see that the first part is a plan-led development, the focus, the 5 focus, and we are very much outcome-oriented. I'm very happy that you put it the outcome-oriented. This is where I learned from, from the past 40 years as a civil servant. And then at the same time, we are also looking into the how can we translate. I always mention to my colleague, how can we translate policy, plan to reality and to impact to on the ground. You come back, we have so many plans, but having your plans and policy is not good enough. We must know how to translate it. And I would like to share with you our latest local plan, was just gazetted in 2040. Local plan for 2040 was just gazetted last June. And I told my colleagues, this is the local plan. Look at the local plan. How can each one of you, you are head of all the 25 departments, how can each one of you implement, translate even one comma or one sentence in the local plan into your day-to-day work? Then only we can say that we achieve the local plan. This within our organization. That's why when you mentioned about the organizational mission, I think that is very important. What is our mission? If we, the 25 of us, don't believe in the local plan, how can we convince outsider to implement it? How can we convince the developer? How can we convince the professional to do it? I think that is when you mentioned about organizational mission, and also the for us, as you mentioned very clearly, the private sector will be very boastful to say that I failed 5 times, but now I succeed. But not in the government. If you fail once, you will be on the front page, and you maybe any other day you will be sacked. I think when you have the opportunity tomorrow, when you are in front of the the secretary for the government, there will be a lot of big guns there in Putrajaya. Please share this. Please give the government servant a fair share to fail in order to succeed. Don't put them, if you are failed, then you will get your disciplinary and then end up to be set. But fail in this sense is honest fail. Sometimes we also something that is fail but is dishonest. So I hope you know what I mean. So I think this is very important for us to look into that. Another one is also when you mentioned about the mission. We have the City for All mission. So I always mention to my colleague, how do you translate city for all? Which are KL is a city for? Who are these all? I think in any work that we are doing, we have to always remember our mission and whatever that we do. At the same time, I'm very happy to share with Azlina. I said you better buy the big corn. That is very, and even during the biodiversity conference that's now at the Samdabi, they're also talking about the big corn. And you mentioned that. I think that when I came to Dbkl, to City Hall, I gave an instruction. I said I want to reduce 40% of the consultant using of the consultant in this city. Because why? I don't want our planners, our engineers, our architects, they don't even know how to draw a plan anymore. Because everything, they have the money, they get the consultant. They don't even know how to draw a very simple, maybe market accordingly, so that is according to the guideline. We are always imposed, because every time we have the money, the next stage is consultant. Also same with the UN. When I was in the UN, also like that. So, the moment that we had the money from the state, the next stage is which consultant they will have.
And
so,
it costs money. The fiscal pressure.
Yes. So yes, that's why when you got money, then the next one is consultant. So when I said that I reduce 40, actually they reduce 57%, 59% using of consultant, because I want them to get back the skill, to get back the knowledge, so that they can understand. So I think this is also important when you mention that. And then it's also I'm very happy when you mentioned about the dynamic and also the urgency of the program. Because sometimes we say that we are not affected, it's okay. But you are not affected now, maybe tomorrow. So I think when you mentioned about the urgency, I also share with my colleagues, if you can do it today, why wait tomorrow? But of course I see that is sometimes I know this work-life balance. work-life balance, but still, I think that's the agency is very, and the people-centered. I always mention about when I was in the UN, they say the smart city. I add on the people-centered smart city. It took nearly 3 days discussion in order to be endorsed by the member state, people-centered smart city. So I think this is also, important. And last but not least, that I would like to Kuala Lumpur, in whatever work that you have now, maybe if you want to collaborate with us, we are open to that. Only say, maybe after that, it's only the mayor said that we are not. So we are here. We are happy to work together with you because we want to learn. So if you want to say that the city's indicators, take us as one of the examples, because then we can have we know where we are. So of course, within the Malaysia, we are considered that it's not that bad, but we also want to compare with other cities outside Malaysia which are better. So again, thank you so much, and I really hope that you can come back to Kuala Lumpur. This time maybe more holiday, longer, and I really hope that you will enjoy your time tomorrow. But unfortunately, I plan to join your session tomorrow actually, but somehow today I saw there is a plan, there is a program with the Prime Minister. So I'm not sure whether, let's see, I will try my best to go to Putrajaya and to join you, and when are you going back?
Tomorrow night.
Wow. Tomorrow day. Okay, so safe travel back to London?
To London.
To London, then hopefully, please keep that honorary degree of the UCL for me. I was invited to attend by the King's Foundation to attend this year at the St. James Palace. But being a mayor, it's not easy to go out from the country. So I told the King Foundation, hold on, maybe after 15th of August next year, I don't know. After I complete my mandate as a mayor, so maybe keep first so that maybe I will get it after that. So you in the UCL, thank you so much for all your support from UN and now at the Kuala Lumpur, and I hope that we can continue working together with you. Thank you so much, Vinaya. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sri. Now if I be Dr. Sri to present a token of appreciation from Kedah City Hall to Professor Mariana. Thank you all for your attendance, and thank you again, Mariana, and of course Nina, and of course our dear Mayor. Thank you all for attending this very informal meeting, and I think the message is clear for us. The mission is to make KL a livable and lovable city, and we really hope to be working with you, Mariana, and your institute going forward. And once again, I think we'd like to invite you for tea, and then subsequently to take a photograph. Okay, yeah, and also.
Yes. Okay, great.
Okay, thank you all so much.
Thank you so much.